Very good morning and welcome to this Perspective series brought to you by the DG Murray Trust. My name is Sizwe Mpofu Walsh and I will be your moderator for today. The Czech statesman and philosopher Václav Havel once spoke about an era in which things were happening so fast that people didn't have enough time to be astonished. And I think we're very much in one of those eras in our country. We have reasons to be astonished and hopeful, reasons to be astonished and fearful, reasons to be astonished and everything in between. And in today's panel, we will be dissecting our current political moment and how it relates to various different sectors of South African society with a wonderful and erudite panel. In terms of hope, President Ramaphosa, of course, in his inauguration speech, kicked off in customary fashion, suggesting that this was a new era for South Africa and that this was a time when governance priorities would take precedence and a new moment of national unity could begin. But we also know that our country faces a series of systemic crises and challenges which have played out in recent weeks for all to see. We know that unemployment, inequality, and poverty remain rife. We know that social disunity remains a problem. And we also know that we have been struggling with the basics of governance affecting the most vulnerable in our society. So to chew through this mixture of emotions that we're all feeling, we have a very important panel with us today. We've got, of course, Dr. David Harrison, who is the CEO of the DG Murray Trust. And we're very glad to have him not only sharing his insights and experience over many years within this sector and how it interfaces with government, but also, of course, bringing his perspectives from the trust itself. We've got Prof. William Gumede, who's Associate Professor at the Wits School of Governance, who is one of our country's most foremost thinkers around questions of politics and governance. We've got Ms. Pearl Pillay, who's Managing Director at Youth Lab and a board member of the NYDA, someone who has vast experience working at the interface of South Africa's governance challenges and youth questions, and we're very glad to have her here today as well. And last but not least, Ms. Jordan Peters, who's a Cape Town-based youth organizer, a writer and activist filmmaker, and she's also a founding member of the Cape Youth Collective, and we welcome her today to also share her experiences of activism from a youth perspective. We're obviously having this conversation at a fascinating time because if reports are to be believed, and one doesn't know what reports are to be believed anymore, we stand on the cusp of a potential new cabinet announcement sometime soon. And with all the focus on palace politics, it can be easy to forget that we have a government that will have to deliver. It has policy discussions to have, and it also will need to be setting an agenda for what its priorities will be. And that's also where we want to drive this conversation, no matter who makes up that cabinet. What should their goals be for a new administration? Without further ado, then, let me begin our panel discussion and open a question to all of our panelists. And we'll begin with you, Dr. Harrison. We know our country faces deep-seated socio-economic crises. What do you believe are the most critical actions or the key priorities for any new government coming into South Africa in this moment? And that same question to all our panelists to kick off. Dr. Harrison.
Well, Sizwe, thank you very much. And it really is a pleasure to be part of this panel today. I mean, as I reflect on what led up to the elections and the dominant narratives, I mean, a lot of those, well, what was top of the pops was the need to create jobs. And a lot of the presentation of solution was framed in economic terms. And I think that we have to reframe at least part of the economic challenge, reassert the human development challenge in South Africa. There's not going to be employment without capability. There's not going to be skills without education. There's not going to be productivity without food security. If we don't keep people and I would argue children at the center, we are not going to achieve the goal, the targets in terms of economic growth and productivity that we expect. So I mean, I think it was very useful and seminal that the president's first statement was that through their votes, people have asserted that they want enough food to eat. That's the first thing he said. And I think, as we think about what needs to happen, and as we think about the human development that needs to happen, we've got to, I mean, it's ultimately going to start with children, isn't it? How do we transform the trajectory over the next 2 decades in South Africa? It's by allowing our children being born today, all 2,800 of them being conceived or being born today, to grow up experiencing a fundamentally different experience of life than their parents did. So, food security. A quarter of our children are nutritionally stunted. The fundamental problem we have in the country is that the cost of protein is too high. So we've got to do something about that. We've got to confront the challenge of protein through greater affordability, through greater buying power, through greater food production around protein. That's number one. Secondly, our focus must be on early brain development, on early language development. And we know that there's been some progress with respect to 3 to 6 year olds and the new ECD policy of the Department of Basic Education, recognizing the need to expand rapidly early learning programs. But we mustn't forget about the 0 to 3 year olds. That's where brain development happens. And so thinking about an intensive program of support to 0 to 3 year olds is absolutely critical. Child protection. Child vulnerability in South Africa happens in the home. It happens in communities. It's not really about health facilities or educational facilities. It's what's happening in the home. And so we've got to confront the factors that are driving child vulnerability in the home. We've got to prevent child abuse. And so we've got to be thinking smartly about strategies to do it, and reducing the degree of heavy drinking in South Africa is a major strategy. Building agency and identity among our adolescents is critical for the type of capability that we're speaking about. And then we mustn't forget about people with disability, a significant proportion of disability that can be stopped if we screen children early for hearing problems, if we screen children early for visual problems. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Harrison, for kicking us off there. Ms. Pillay, can I move to you? And Dr. Harrison, maybe I should start using people's first names if they don't mind.
Please, if you wouldn't mind, I'd appreciate that. Thanks.
Pearl and David. Pearl, David says, there's been a lot of focus on the economy, but we need to move to a more developmental focus, and then places the spotlight on children and other vulnerable groups in our society. What are your thoughts on where the priorities for this new government should lie?
I mean, I think David's right in that we do need to prioritize children. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me. But I think on our end, I think one of the key priorities is obviously youth unemployment, and specifically the way our education system feeds or exacerbates our unemployment crisis, right? So we need to address the fact that education is still incredibly commodified. It shuts most young people out of our education system. It's unaffordable, and it doesn't adequately prepare them for the world of work. We need to create or rather prioritize education that gears people towards work, right? So things like recapacitating our TVETs, resourcing our TVETs well, and ensuring there's a better pipeline from TVET to employment. But we have to address the youth unemployment crisis. I think having 10 million young people who are not in education, employment, or training, having the bulk of South Africans' youth sitting at home unemployed, employed is, we keep saying, we've been saying for years that it's a ticking time bomb. It's not a time bomb anymore, right? I think it's something that has clearly exploded, and you see it in the way we have so many different social fractures, right? If you look at the mental health crisis that young people are experiencing, if we look at the statistics on our drug use, right? If we look at just the state of young people's well-being and their ability and appetite to then contribute towards democracy. We've just come off an election, and we don't have the official kind of stats about how many young people voted, but we know those numbers are low, right? This election saw our lowest voter turnout since 94, and it's a familiar line because we said that in the previous election too. And so by and large, young people are becoming more and more disengaged with what the idea of being South African is and what it means to live in this country. And that's largely because we've shut them out of the economy, we've shut them out of education, and then we've said, oh, well, you were the majority. And so I think for this government, we have to take very seriously our youth employment crisis. And I think we do that through mainstreaming young people, right? So this idea that you need to have youth employment programs, as if youth are not the majority. All our employment programs should be youth employment programs, right? We need to address the idea that young people are trapped in this internship culture, that the only ideas we seem to have for job placements is through internships. And so you create this revolving door where young people just move from internship to internship and they don't find gainful employment. And so I think for me, we've been saying this for a really long time, outside of basic services, outside of prioritizing ECD and child nutrition, which I think are crucially important, we really need to be able to address and spotlight and mainstream youth employment issues.
Jordan, both Pearl and David have focused on youth in different ways. What are your thoughts as a youth activist as well on what the priorities for a new government should be?
Thank you, and good morning to everyone. I think David quite clearly set, the groundwork for what needs to be focused on when it comes to youth and children. But as a young activist, to be quite honest, I'm very jaded. I'm really struggling with my cynicism. I'm not sure that any of those things that have been mentioned is going to be adequately cared about, seen to, even with this new cabinet that we, are still waiting for and hoping for and wondering about. And I think that, I guess in my personal experience, I've worked with children's homes, I've worked with high school educators, primary school educators, ECD educators. And I think that we often look at these statistics from a very impersonal, formal way, the numbers on a piece of paper. And maybe that's the issue as well. Because if you actually look around, if you speak to teachers, if you speak to social workers, you will see that the Department of Social Development is basically non-existent. Basic education is on its dying breath. I speak to young teachers who have no idea how to even communicate with the learners in their class because those learners are on drugs. A report just came out in the Daily Voice saying that an 8-year-old on the Cape Flats was tested and it was found that he had 4 drugs in his system: Mandrax, heroin, even cheap cocaine. So I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that, we already have policies in place, progressive policies. We have this, amazing constitution, but where is the implementation? And how do we keep these politicians accountable to the promises that they've made? And so while I think that these type of conversations are very important, I think they've also been happening for the last, 30 years. And so I guess, a starting point for me is, how do we take these conversations into, methods of accountability, mechanisms of actual change? And how do we take, the promises made and bring it into the real world and make it felt by the people who most need it? I'll leave it there for now because I can't monologue, and I'll give you back the floor.
Thank you, Jordan. And important interventions there. William, we've got perspectives on the need to focus on youth, but also Jordan raises an important sense in which there's a great deal of disillusionment. What are your thoughts on the priorities for this new government?
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. I'm very excited to talk to you, and I'm going to take it from what Jordan, from her vantage point. I mean, when she said that, well, she feels jaded, we've had many of these discussions over the last 30 years. Nothing has happened. There's been no responses. And maybe, and I think the reason why I am excited right now is that the problem is if you have a party that is in power for a very, very long time, and people vote for the party no matter their present records and based on the past and based on sort of solidarity, color, and those sort of things, you undermine accountability almost immediately. So, I mean, you know, there would be no incentive for that party to do anything. So there'll be conversations and so on, but you know, there's no incentive because the party know they will get in every time and they'll appoint the same people over and over again. So for me, that's the most exciting period where we are, the uncertainty, and one can already see it. I mean, and I obviously have got a bit of a conflict of interest because I'm also part of the play, advising you know, the parties on GNU models and you know all the sort of things and just on a basic negotiations. So there is a bit of you know, so I may not be as objective potentially because of that. But having said that, I think it is an important moment because I've actually seen, you know, the ANC people that I've been engaged with since 1994, whether it's a journalist, whether it's academic, or whether as an advisor to governments, where people actually, because they know they're going to be re-elected over and over again, no incentive for you know, first to bring in fresh blood, bring in new people to be accountable. And I can, you know, sort of already, the humbleness is something that I have not seen since 1994. And I have been, you know, I've been from late 94 onwards covering as a political correspondent, initially, and then editing national newspapers. I have not seen this kind of, for the first time, I've seen what we should have seen since 1994, a humbleness and an acceptance that things are wrong. I haven't seen that before, and I think that's a very, very good start. So I think in terms of, you know, what do we do? What should be done? To start off with David, without a capacity, you know, we're not going to create the jobs. We're not going to turn the institutions around. So that's the first thing. So I mean, it's a capacity. I mean, exciting and for me, and also the same time very disappointing that we have the capacity in the country, but for the last 30 years, the country's capacity, the country's energy, the country's ideas has not been used because the ANC had become a very small group running the country. The same people have been appointed since 1994 in government or in cabinets and so on. And you know, and sadly, when countries are run by small groups of people, it's like an inbreeding, and you're for too long. You know, the energy of the country is just gone. It's like I'm not using the capacity to use, and people feel jaded, totally hopeless because they've got ideas, but the ideas are not going to be listened to unless it's for superficial purpose, PR purpose. I think potentially there's an opportunity now for outside ideas to come in for the first time, even a government of national unity. And again, as I say, maybe not, I'm not totally objective, yeah, but the idea of the government of national unity is always to bring in fresh blood, to bring in other people and other resources and other ideas into a government. And I think that what makes, but for me, very exciting. But I mean, the model, if we can, if the model can be expanded of the GNU, where it is not just the governments, but civil society, the private sector, youth and communities are part of the delivery. Professionals are part of the delivery. I think we'll get somewhere.
Could I stick with you, having come to you last, William, and ask, you've painted a rosy picture, and I think it's important that we hold that space for hope, because we don't have anything else after the government we get. There is a worry that this could result in a government that's unable to be decisive. What do you think about those concerns?
Yes, you know, so we've had a history the last couple of years of governments that hasn't been decisive at any point. And when it was decisive under the Jacob Zuma presidency, it was decisive in a negative way, you know, from a corrupt a point of view. Yes, there is that worry, but I think if the ANC accept some of the proposals put to it and how the GNU could function, our government is run on the basis of clusters. So, for example, if some of the key clusters we talk about infrastructure, then we need to tackle the state capacity. We need to tackle food safety, the quality of education, and so on. So, those core clusters, they're going to create the jobs if you do it competently. Now, if those clusters could be almost handed over to run to fresh blood, to totally new people, and in partnership with civil society, business, and professionals, I think there's a potential, and if those people could be held accountable publicly through that sort of cluster system. I mean, it's there already. Unfortunately, it's just never been implemented in cabinets, and I have been part of the last inquiry on restructuring it was called the professionalization of government and so on. So I think there's a potential that I don't want to say individualizing delivery systems, but I think there is the potential of that happening, and that may open up the space for delivery.
Pearl, could I come back to you on this subject? Because I think William's opened up a really interesting avenue of inquiry around. There are reasons to be hopeful because we may see new avenues of accountability. Parliament may come into its own. One party won't be able to dictate the future. On the other hand, there are concerns that we could face endless consultations, and it's not clear exactly how this will be operationalized. What are your thoughts on whether we should be hopeful or fearful in this moment of a new government?
I think it's interesting because I think it's important for us to have a healthy balance of both. I think on the one hand, this is a time of incredible anxiety. And I think especially from a citizen's point of view, nobody really knows what's going on, right? You just know what you see on social media and what you hear on the news, and suddenly, everyone's an expert and everyone's an analyst and everyone has insider info, and the WhatsApp groups are popping off, and and so people are sitting here going, who knows what's going to happen? And rightfully so, because it is a new time and it's a new time for everybody. And I think especially on the side of our leaders, I think it's important to humanize that aspect where even for them, right, the idea of 2 weeks to form a government was an idea that was created without coalitions in mind, right? It's just not reasonable in this current context. And I think it's okay to say, listen, nobody really knows what they're doing, but we're trying to figure it out. And maybe we'll get there and maybe we won't, but this is the kind of buy-in that we need from everyone. And so I think a little bit of healthy fear and a little bit of healthy anxiety is good because it means that it humanizes people and it gives us an opportunity to understand that maybe we'll make some mistakes and maybe things might not go off as smoothly as we want to, but we're committed to the process of building and of figuring out what this new normal should be like. I think hope is necessary too, right? Because I think so much about what we miss about governance and about leading a country and about running a government is that it's something that's it should be based on love, and love for our country, love for the citizens of our country, and a commitment to people's well-being and being able to live the lives that they want to live. And it's important to have hope in that way, because without hope, what do we have? And I know this might sound like, very like hippy-dippy and very kumbaya, but I think it's important as citizens because if we give up hope and if we think, we're just going to sit in endless consultations and no decisions are going to get made, and what happens if John Steenhuisen is the deputy president, we can find ourselves becoming very despondent, and that despondency leads to inaction. What we've been talking about so much in the lead up to elections as well as post-election is accountability. And I think now more than in a lot of the recent years, young people specifically are looking for ways to hold government accountable, right? They're watching these processes. I was on a flight when parliamentarians were being sworn in, and people were sitting on the flight watching, or as the flight was about to take off, watching the YouTube stream, right? I've never seen that before. And I think it signals the idea that people want to be engaged, right? And I think it's that kind of hope that keeps you engaged, keeps you learning about what does accountability look like. Because I agree with Jordan, I don't think we have strong accountability measures for citizens, right? Lots of people will say, how do we hold our leaders accountable? Because we don't know. And the processes we do have don't seem to be citizen-centered. And so I think that level of hope gives rise to new ideas and new solutions, but we have to kind of balance it with a rightful anxiety of what's going to happen next.
Absolutely. It's nice to remind us that we don't have to move to either of the extremes. And a reminder to everyone watching that you can also submit your questions, because we'll have a Q&A after we've concluded this panel discussion. David, can I come to you just on the same theme, just to develop this conversation a bit further? And of course, we will move to some of the more practical solutions that can be in later parts of our conversation. But how do we respond to this new political moment? There are various worries which maybe you want to expand on, and then there are also various opportunities which we may not have seen, and any response to what the panelists have already said.
Well, I must say I'm also excited. I also have been working in sort of systems development pre-94 onwards, and the opening of the playing field is a very, very exciting time, and the opportunity is only going to be seized if we seize it, if we step up. And I think, and by we I mean those of us in the new government of national unity, but those of us also in civil society and in the private sector and in the trade unions who step up and are willing to start carving out new strategies and new ways of doing things. And I think the GNU is going to be looking for some common ground, things that bring people along and bring them together. There's going to be so much contestation, but if we can define common ground for the GNU, I think it's going to attract attention. It's going to attract focus, and for us, this message of centering children, centering youth development as absolutely essential to the pathway for the runway for the country for the next 10 to 15 years is something that is surely non-contentious, is something that people can surely buy into. So that I think is the first, is the first task, is to convey the sense that we've got to, as the National Development Plan said, put children at the center, put this process of scaffolding from conception up to adulthood and those pathways, put that back at the center and hold that firm in all of our development efforts, and get people to buy into that, concept. But then I think, as William said, the opportunity is forging new relationships across not only the political parties, but across the sectors, business, civil society, trade unions, a government working together. But that can't simply be a bland call for collaboration, because we know that then we will get bogged down. We will just keep talking the same stuff over and over and over. There needs to be defined interfaces. We've got to find clear new ways, new institutional mechanisms whereby government, civil society, the private sector can work together on an agenda for children, for example. And that has profound implications for even the way that the Auditor General works. So if in fact we're going to have civil society agencies that are recipients of government money towards a common end, if we're going to exploit the full expertise across the country, the Auditor General is going to have to accept that there are significant civil society players that receive significant pots of government money, income transfers, who do a job that government should be doing but hasn't done, and now can't do except in partnership. So I think that is going to be the focus for the next year, is defining not only the common agenda, but also the mechanisms for working together. And that is going to require some profound shifts in the way that government has operated in the past.
Indeed, and this rare window, as I come to you, Jordan, is maybe an opportunity for those of us who are outside the state, outside politics, to set the agenda anew and actually cause government and politicians to react to our demands rather than theirs. You injected an important note of caution, talking about being jaded and feeling as though we've heard this all before. How do you respond to the conversation so far, and where do you sit on the hope versus fear spectrum?
I mean, to start off, I would say that, there's this quote that says, hope is not a strategy, and it's also not an action. And, just because I find myself as a part of the majority of disaffected youth doesn't mean we aren't doing things. There's also a need to, I guess, caution when speaking about, the hopeless as being, inactive. I think that, in terms of my personal politics, to speak to that, it's based off of civil society in the 80s. I'm a ghetto historian. I spent a lot of my life working with different museums, teaching young people about apartheid, about slavery, colonialism. So when I think of civil society as a start, I think about the UDF, I think about churches, I think about sports teams, cultural groups, coming together, forming these mass movement moments. I don't think about NPOs, and so it's difficult for me when we talk about civil society, when we talk about action, to look at the current framework that exists in South Africa in terms of organizing, in terms of activism, in terms of youth dialogues. We have to ask ourselves, who is in the room with us right now? Who is able to speak? Who is able to have a seat at the table? And so I think, to be very honest and very blunt, and I think I'm the youngest person here, so I can be, the sharp edge. But I think that if we're looking at the current systems of change and change making in South Africa, I don't think it's here. I don't think it's on the ground. It's amongst the unemployed youth. If you look at what happened in Kenya right now, it wasn't an NPO, led movement. It was an organic upspringing of hopelessness, of anger. And so when we look at, hope versus anxiety, I think I'm very centered in the reality that young people are change makers already. I meet brilliant young people all the time who are going above and beyond, young teachers, young social workers, young artists, but they have no resources. They have, no practical help. And when we look at how money flows in this country, it often doesn't go to the places where change is actually, being seen and being felt and being heard. There was an organization on the radio last night on SAFM talking about, the current war on the Cape Flats and how, this is something that goes on an almost daily basis. It's school holidays right now, and kids can't even play outside for fear of being shot dead. That organization, has to have these mini fundraisers every other month because they don't have any resources. So if we want to look at practical ways of moving forward, if we want to look at actual change in our lifetimes, we need to also start rethinking systems of change and structures of how change is made, and also stop, I guess, infantilizing young people. I hate Youth Month. I hate Youth Month because there's all this messaging of the youth must lead, the youth will one day take over the country, and da-da-da-da. The youth is already doing a lot, but they don't have any resources to enact real change. So I think there's a need for us to also look at ourselves, as civil society, as people in positions of power and decision making, and ask ourselves, are we also not possibly standing in the way of change? I'll leave it there.
Absolutely. Very important points made. And I'm enjoying our conversation because I think this is the conversation that is happening across the country right now, where we're not sure whether to celebrate or to commiserate or to do all at once. And it's fascinating to hear these different perspectives. Jordan, I think you make some really important points about, at the end of the day, when all is said and done, to what extent will people's lives change? And those people whose lives haven't changed for 30 years, to what extent will there be tangible change? And maybe we can move the conversation onto that ground and speak about, from your different perspectives, what are the longest levers that we can pull, or what are the practical steps that you would like to see being taken that could actually turn this from a moment of uncertainty into a moment of victory? So Pearl, maybe let me start with you on the questions that you've raised about youth unemployment and youth development, and then just go around the panel for the specific levers.
Sure. I mean, I think there are a few, right? The one is that I think we need to, Jordan is right that there's such a widening gap between who gets resources and who needs resources, right? And you see it even in the NGOs, in the NGO sector. So I run an organization called Youth Lab, and we've been in existence for 12 years, and we're an unfunded organization. And when you look at organizations that have access to big funding, right, it's people that come from networks where, you went to private schools and your friend's mom is on the board of Anglo. And, there's all of these social networks that kind of push people out. And these are for people who, maybe went to university and have access to resources, but still can't kind of make that jump. What then do you think of organizations that are in communities, right, and don't even have access even to that kind of middle level social networks? And so we're widening the gap between who gets resources that can actually benefit young people in communities, and who gets resources so they can say that they have them. And we need to find a way to lessen that gap. The one way I think is we need to take very seriously what youth leadership actually looks like, right? We have structures like the NYDA, and there's lots of criticisms of the agency that I also echo, and the ways in which it's often disconnected from the realities of young people. But the NYDA is one instrument, right? And it's one instrument that doesn't have the resources to reach the number of young people that it needs to. But you have young people in communities that are so active. When we see community protests, it's young people that organize them and show up to them. When we run workshops in communities, right, and this can be said for any organization, it's young people that show up. And yet those people are the ones that are left out of resources. But I think what needs to happen is we need to really think about what it means when we say we want to mainstream young people in decision-making processes. Putting young people in parliament, the 5 of them that do get to go there, is not the lever to pull, right? Because just because you're young doesn't mean you actually represent the interests of young people. We need to be able to create spaces, and I hate, it's such NGO talk when you're creating spaces and you're like creating platforms, but we need to be able to take seriously what community-based youth leadership looks like and find ways to give those voices power. And it might mean collaborating with organizations that do have presence and connections in those kinds of communities. People like Jordan, right, who does extensive work to spotlight the work of young activists. And we need to be able to close that gap. But we also need to be able to take seriously young people in this country. We had the Department of Women, Youth, and People with Disabilities, but it was led by the oldest person in cabinet, right? That doesn't tell you very much about how well respected young people are. Right? When we talk about Youth Month, right, it's these rallies that you bring young people into a stadium and you talk about all these opportunities that they should be getting. But the cost of finding a job, Capital did research on this 2 years ago, the cost of finding a job, looking for a job, not finding a job, looking for a job, an average young person needs on average 500 Rand a month. The SRD grant is 370 Rand. So even the interventions that we are creating is so divorced from the realities that young people are experiencing. And so I think we need, number one, government programming that is rooted in research that is based on the lived experiences of young people. And we need to be able to empower young people who are actually in communities doing the work to be at decision-making tables, or at the very least, to be able to figure out how to get resources through the right channels to the right people.
Right. William, can I come to you on what you think the specific actions that can move us forward might be? And I know you've also done a lot of thinking around, just from a governance perspective with this amount of complexity, you know, how government can actually act and not just constitute itself.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think perhaps the first thing would be agency. How do we strengthen the agency of individual citizens? I mean, that's absolutely going to be important. I mean, for me, I've actually increasingly begun to think of possibly that we should spend much more time in agency. And Jordan, just to respond, I mean, from your side, I'm looking at civil society as mass movement. I think what we have to do, and linking it to agency, is to say, I mean, what can you do as the individual on your own? I think that's the first. And can we strengthen the agency of the individual? And it would, and I guess hope will be a very big part of it, because I mean, if you feel hopeless, really it undermines your agency. So how can we use this moment to almost re-energize individual agency again? I think that's going to be the first, and that it's going to be very important for civil society to help also in that process. For me, the second thing in terms of, you know, how do we collaborate? So how does individuals collaborate? Then also how does community and civil society organizations collaborate? So it's not just individual, but also the individual collaborating with others, like-minded, and so on. And then there is, for me, that's the state civil society nexus. You know, how does the civil society use this moment now to push? I mean, you know, to push. So even civil society's agency will also have to change in order to use this moment. And then for me, it is also citizens and the state, the agency of citizens to fight, you know, to push back the state. I mean, you go to Home Affairs. I was just at Home Affairs with my son, who, you know, to get his passport, renew his passport, and I realized in terms of just the treatment, how the public servants treat ordinary citizens in a Home Affairs context. So how does citizens respond at that basis? You know, take the agency to say, I am not going to be treated by a civil servant like this. You know, I'm not going to be treated rudely. So that, you know, so agencies in that, the individual and the state agency. Of course, there is often agency, but not in a almost in a constructive way, not to burn out the Home Affairs Department. You know, there's also a certain kind of more toxic agency. And I mean, I'm just thinking in terms of, if you think about government has said there's a national dialogue. They want to put together a national dialogue. And that is, for example, one place. Do we want the same people to run that national dialogue? Do we want the Thabo Mbeki's, those sort of people? I mean, then the same issues and the same sort of stuff, tired, jaded people? Or is this a moment actually where we say, really, young people, can they drive the process to challenge, you know, the received thinking, the old ideas, the policies and stuff, and the people and the kind of leadership that we used to, which are terrible, which is not fit for purpose.
Yeah, very, very interesting. So taking over the national dialogue is one key priority in that case. And important points David raised by William about, you know, individual agency by Pearl and Jordan about really giving power to those who are actually already doing work on the ground. What are your thoughts when it comes to, you know, the priorities you've raised around early childhood development, around child nutrition? You know, first 100 days, what are the key priorities and the key levers that can be pulled to take steps forward rather than sideways?
Thanks, Sizwe. And first, just to I mean, just to reinforce what people have said, I mean, we mustn't think of the NGO sector as just some big NGOs across the country. There are 230,000 NGOs, activist NGOs, constituencies, more organized NGOs, creating this incredibly rich fabric of support and provisioning and community activation. That's what we're talking about. That's the asset that needs to be recognized and brought to the table and asserted as of equal importance and as equal right to be at the table as the private sector, for example. So, I mean, I was just sort of thinking back to 1994 and just the incredible euphoria that followed democratic elections. But then those first 100 days were a time of incredible energy. So certainly in the health sector where I was working at the time, free healthcare for all, for women and children initially, and then free healthcare that was extended. The primary school nutrition program. There were some very discreet, very groundbreaking shifts that were made at that time. That's what we need to be looking for in this first 100 days. We've got to be identifying what are the things that potentially can make a big difference. I mean, we've been arguing for a basket of highly nutritious, high-protein foods to be made more affordable through a combination of a government subsidy and private sector coming in and waiving their profit margins on those products, just because we know that the food crisis in South Africa is driven by the high cost of protein. There's something that can be done. It'll cost the state 3 billion rand. That's not huge compared to the whole crisis. But what it can do is it can be one of those game changers that reduces the price of food, of these high protein foods, by about a third. So that's the type of mentality we need to have. What are those sort of game changers that can be done now? And then, as William said, we've got to be thinking about what is this institutional change that we want to see and how do we bring it about? And we've been working with the presidency to say, look, if we're going to accelerate movement for children in South Africa, one, there needs to be clear presidential leadership for children and young people in the country. That's the first thing. Secondly, understand that child and youth vulnerability is happening in homes and in communities, and that requires an intersectoral response. It requires everybody to work together. Three, it requires us to fill the gaps in service delivery, achieve greater synergy across implementing partners across the country, and address some of the key harms that are making things worse in this country. So for example, we're stuck. We haven't seen movement on the liquor amendment bill for the last 5 years. That's fundamental in our fight against heavy drinking in this country. That sort of issue needs to be unlocked right away under the ambit of this broad presidential commitment to children. And then civil society needs to be able to step up and say, well, if we want to accelerate progress for children, we're willing to be an accelerator. And that's what we're busy working with the presidency at the moment, is to establish an accelerator for children, not a single organization, but bringing together this collective effort across society, the energy, the institutions and the expertise across society towards some of the priorities, particularly those that have been most neglected in the past. That's the type of thinking, that's the type of energy that we saw in 1994, and that needs to be revived.
Well, many questions are streaming in, and so we will move towards concluding our part of the discussion, and then we'll open it up to your questions. So could I ask the panelists to just conclude and give us any final thoughts that they have in 2 minutes or so, and touch on any issues in the conversation that they'd like to accentuate, and then we'll open it up for half an hour of questions. And Jordan, I'll start with you, go to Pearl, William, and we'll conclude with David.
Okay, thank you. Well, I want to go back to William's point about agency very quickly, because I do agree, but I think the issue is that we are a country that forgets it seems like we have this collective amnesia, actually. And when we look at all of these issues, if you go back 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, you'll actually find the root cause of these issues, whether it be children drinking, whether it be our education system, healthcare system, etc. And so at what point do we as a country, as a society, say that these issues, we are constantly looking at the symptoms of it and never really treating the root cause? And so CAPE, the Cape Youth Collective, the organization that I founded, is based off of a historical mandate of young people in this country. It's actually self-styled from an organization, a youth political formation in the 80s. And it always just comes down to, before people could vote, before there were NPOs, how was it that our communities were able to organize themselves? So when it comes to issues of agency and agency building, I always use history as a starting point. And you should see, young people learning about the young people who came before them, whether it be in Philippi or Bonteheuwel, areas in Cape Town today that are gang-ridden, where there are high unemployment rates, high dropout rates, high instances of substance abuse. And then they hear about the young people of Bonteheuwel from the 80s and what they were able to achieve. It's like a light goes on in their eyes because they realize that they do have power, that they did have power, and that there are mechanisms to build that power again. But as I always say, that it isn't a miracle, overnight reality. It's going to take time. And I think when we look at these issues and we look at the responses to these issues, we also need to be willing to put in that time, that tedious work of building organizations, of capacitating youth to actually find that power again, find that agency, because, just as we struggle with issues today, in the same way, organizations in our history, weren't built overnight. So as a, to end off, I would say that we as a society, we need to remember what we've done. We need to stop trying to recreate the wheel from scratch. There are a lot of lessons in our past, even recent past, that can help us, that can light the way to change. I also think, just as the end of point, that we can talk about the government of national unity, etc., but if we don't have a clear national dream or a clear national identity, we are continuously going to be having this conversation because we have no pathway, and I can use an example like China, maybe a bit of an awkward example of having a clear national identity and a clear national dream that all citizens buy into. Right now, we are just trying to pretend to be a nation, and we are seeing the cracks of that across our political spectrum.
Cool.
Thanks, Sizwe. I think, a lot of what we've been speaking about, especially post-election, is the kind of government we want to see and the kind of leadership that we want. A lot of in the work that we've been doing is trying to think about what kind of citizenry we want, right? For the next 5 years and beyond. What does an empowered, informed, active citizenry look like? The one thing I think for me is we have to take seriously in the next 5 years before the next election, but in general as the nation, what does civics education actually look like, right? We've gone around the country in the lead up to elections, chatting to young people about manifestos and voting and, our new voting system and all of that. And what we found, and we found this throughout our existence as an organization, is that our voter education is incredibly low. And it's not just from young people, right? Across the board. When I went to my voting station on election day, I had to explain to the presiding officer why we had 3 ballots, right? And I was like, this does not bode well for the rest of the day. But I think we need to really take seriously the fact that we have an electorate that doesn't know what a ward councillor is meant to do. They don't know what a ward committee is. They don't know what an IDP is. And if you at that basic level don't even know what mechanisms there are for you to be engaged and active, then having a conversation about why people are active or not is irrelevant, right? And so I think we need to take very seriously how we shape our citizenry to be more active, to hold government accountable, but also to understand what power agency can give us, right? To be able to use that agency to actually affect change in our communities, and to understand that government is a collaborative process, right? We're fortunate that we have a democracy in which we don't always have to go go and be shot in the streets in order to have our voices heard, right? We do have mechanisms that work, but because we don't often know how to access them, and you don't know what you don't know, I think it shuts a lot of people out. I really liked what Jordan said about having some kind of national vision, right? I think that the National Development Plan was meant to be that thing, and I'm not convinced that it is. But the time frame for our National Development Plan is ending, right? 2030 is around the corner. And so what does a new National Development Plan look like, right? How do we begin to build a vision document, or a vision process for the country for the next 20, 30 years, but in a way that is more citizen-centered? And I think a lot of that starts by improving the way we teach civics, and improving the way we empower citizens with education to know that your vote is not the only way that you show action and that you show participation, that there's so many mechanisms in place that we actually can't use, but we just need to learn how to use them properly.
William.
I mean, for me, it's just if I can take 5 or 6 things. I think the first thing is allocation of capital. I mean, the countries that do well and the countries that fail, allocation of capital is absolutely key. I mean, sadly, we don't discuss that much. But do we get the money to the right places? Firstly, state money to the right places. To the catalytic places. That's the first thing. And so we often talk about developmental state and all those things, but actually the heart of it is also the allocation, the ability to actually get the money to the right kind of people and the right kind of institutions, communities, and so on. I mean, that's going to be core. And that is also linked to the collaborative state, because if we look at the state, I mean, so just in 2010, we put, I was part of the co-author of a report which was rejected by government. It was paid by government, but rejected afterwards by the developmental state, and it was printed and was thrown in the basement and rejected publicly. And one of the arguments that I made in that report was that we must not look at the state as the government, but as the state includes civil society, communities, and so on. It's almost a collaborative state. So the state on its own, if it's the government, that's just one part of the state. So once we begin to think of the state in that way, I think if you citizens, if you're a consumer, you are the state, and you have to be involved. It automatically becomes that. And also your agency, because you're part of the state. If you're not consulted, there's no state, and so on. And I think actually this was a bit of an opportunity for our group who worked on this report to come back and try to bring this. I mean, just the opening potentially now with the GNU to bring some of these things back in. I think the second one for me would be in terms of, can we make, I mean, the youth practically as a core of the next 5-year cycle, and how can we do that? I mean, there's about 5 or 6 things we're struggling as a country. That's now in a crisis in the country. Starting with food, education, energy, all of those things. So can we, for example, introduce, for the 10 to 15 million young people who are now excluded, can we give them a year community service, for example, which are linked to the key crises in the country? Power is the crisis. So can you get it in terms of a young person that deals with renewable energy, that you get the capacity and skills to that? So I'm saying linking, to our big crises. You've got about possibly 8 to 10 really big crises. If we intervene there, it will have a catalytic impact. So can we actually link 10 to 15 million young people to a different kind of employment, skills, empowerment linked to these crises, right? For me, that's going to be very important. And then for me is capacity of the state, but how do we bring the citizens in to improve the capacity of the state. So we think about the capacity of the state is just civil servants working incompetent, or cartridge deployment, and all sorts of things, and corruption. But there's another part of the capacity of the state I think that's very important, where the citizens actually hold them accountable. Citizens give the performance of an individual, of a public servant. So that a public servant's salary and all of those things are dependent on the citizens' response to their public servant. Then we change immediately the culture, almost immediately. Like, let's just say a public servant, you're not going to get your increase unless the customers, the citizens that you served during this year actually gave you like the go ahead that you actually performed. Yeah, leave it there.
Thanks very much. David, will you take us home?
Well, I think that this is a critical moment in our history in South Africa. And we really do stand on the cusp of the rest of history here. And so I think it is really incumbent on us to have a mindset of possibility. I think that that's absolutely fundamental. We know that the anthropologist Arjun Appadurai speaks about the culture of aspiration, that countries have to adopt if in fact they're going to make a difference. So we've got to get that back. We've got to emerge from the gloom and depression of the last 12, 13 years to have far more stronger sense of this can-do attitude. So I do believe that public national leadership, the getting together across sectors, drawing in constituencies that have been marginalized in the past, giving them voice, I think that is a critical starting point for us as we step out into the unknown. But obviously the big challenge, and Jordan has articulated it so clearly, is that we are trapped in our own inequality. We are trapped in the past. And so the solutions that we're talking about are not quick fixes. They're not 5-year solutions. They are 20-year agendas. They are about taking every young baby born today and nurturing them day by day over the course of the next 20 years until they grow up, until their lives are fundamentally different to those of their parents. So this process is a process of intergenerational change. But what we do over the course of the next 10 years is going to fundamentally set the trajectory for the rest of this country. And I'm really persuaded by the words of Ernst Bloch, the Marxist philosopher, who said, hope is the action of throwing ourselves with passion into the world that we want to become, of which we are part. We have a responsibility to be part of making that new world, and that is what creates hope, rather than the sense of any sort of externally driven knowledge or externally driven sense that out there's somebody that is going to make things better for us. It does start with our own agency. It does start with us stepping up to the plate, and that's what I think we all have to do now with the mindset of possibility.
Well, thank you so much, David. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for a fascinating and important conversation that's helped us appreciate where we are and where we hope we might be going, with a dose of realism as well. This is now an opportunity for the audience questions to be fielded. We've got a raft of questions and we won't be able to do justice to all of them. What I'll start with is some comments just to give you a sense of the questions on the panel, and then I'll put certain questions to panelists in the time we have remaining. And if I can once again ask for brevity, because it'll be difficult to get through many of these. So first comment, just to give you a sense of some of the thoughts. We have one from Brian Adams who says, we must not forget that South Africans are not all urban, considering everything said so far, and then rethink how the realities covered here are exponentially worse outside of urban areas. Zete Zimela says, I definitely share the same sentiment, even though other parties may not have experience, that's political parties. How do they get that experience if we don't give them a chance? So now it's zonke bonke. Everyone must now show their capabilities. Scary, but very exciting times. And let me give you one more comment before I come to a specific question. And this is from Zuko Mdai, maybe an opposite sentiment. The GNU will not ensure any socio-economic rights. In fact, it's a major setback on the transformation trajectory. It's nauseating how this whole GNU concoction is being forced down our throats. Now foundations, big NPOs, surely doing this to secure a level of control. This has to be the most talked about ANC announcement, surely because it serves some interests within capital and not the economically excluded. So a range of different comments from hope to dejection. Let me come to a specific question. David, this one goes to you. How do we stop the government working in silos and start looking at a holistic intervention to address the challenges? This is from Herman Smith.
Well, let me build off the first argument about not leaving rural communities out and see what it would mean in practice. So, as I said at the beginning, we have a fundamental challenge that our people don't get enough protein. That's what it boils down to. That's why 28% of our children are stunted. That's why even obesity rates are going up, because people are getting starches but not getting enough food. Now, local food production is absolutely critical, particularly in rural areas, to begin to address this problem. We have a combination of one, government extension services that are meant to provide water tanks, they are meant to provide seedlings and fencing and support into local communities. We have the government's presidential employment stimulus program that's meant to support 120,000 smallholder farmers. We have dozens of local non-government and community-based organizations that are supporting local agricultural production across the country. Many of them working with 200, 300 smallholder farmers at a time, providing training, providing support. Now imagine if we could link those together, if we could bring in extension services, build a youth development pathway into those agricultural extension services, bring in the support that the smallholder farmer support through presidential employment program is doing at the moment, and link that to these nodes of energy these agroecological nodes of energy that are spread in almost every single province in the country. Combine that effort together. Now, that would require the Department of Health and Social Development and the Department of Agriculture working together, but also working with civil society partners, also working together with private industry as we start to develop local supply chains. That's the type of granularity that I think we need, rather than simply talking about intersectoral collaboration, interministerial committees to address some of these big problems. We need to get down to the specifics now.
Absolutely. Jordan, question for you here. And this is about how we can bring those young voices to the fore and actually give them decision-making power. This is from Kanisa.
Well, I mean, I would take a different approach and say that young people must build their own power and build their own organizations. I think, to give you guys a bit of context around Keiko, Keiko is formed from youth activists who are already working and present in various NPOs, various organizations across the Western Cape, but found themselves disillusioned by the lack of change, being assigned to menial tasks, social media, young people must do the social media. And so we actually decided to just come together and build our own organization, completely unfunded, just based off of, a desire for change, young people already working in various communities across the city, and decided, let's just build our own organization. I think young people, if we keep trying to, assert power in places where, these hierarchies exist, where these systems exist, for us to not have power, we are constantly hitting our heads against the wall. So I would actually say that maybe the question should be to people like David, people like William, about how they plan on ensuring that young people have more power and more of a voice, in the spaces that they occupy. But to me, my advice to young people is that you are dealing with intergenerational battles. You are dealing with old battles as well, old scars, old traumas. And the easiest thing to do is to find other young people like yourself and build an organization together.
William, can I come to you? Various questions for you around the modalities of a GNU, but one in particular, maybe an expansion on your point about individual agency. How can individuals plug into the GNU?
Yeah, I mean, just on the modalities of the GNU, I mean, let me just quickly, for those who are interested, I think, the difference between a GNU and an ordinary coalition, maybe to start off with that. The ordinary coalitions, party gets a majority, and then you put a coalition together to get a majority, and that's it, and then you govern. With the government of national unity, you make a couple of assumptions. The first assumption is that you may have a majority or you may not have a majority. So you can put a government of national unity together, even if you have a 50-plus majority. But there's a big underlining assumption in the government of national unity that there's a crisis, a systemic crisis in a society. That's the first start, and that is why a country was, whether it is a minority party or majority party, would decide to go for a government of national unity. And in that crisis, cannot be resolved alone by one party alone, or by the leaders of one party, or by the ideas of one party. So that really is the fundamental spirit of a GNU in real terms. And so to start off, now the practicality of putting a GNU together, it's different ways. One way is a much more inclusive way, which I've been trying to push. And let me explain what I push to the parties in terms of what could be inclusive way. One would be, the participants in a GNU. All of them won't necessarily get executive jobs in ministries, but a core group would get. That's the one way of doing it. And others, components will get other things. For example, positions in the legislature, or even positions outside in other, inquiries and so on. So you kind of spread things. So, one way. Secondly, to bring in civil society. And when I say civil society, I talk about it much more broadly. Civil society would be the private sector, would be trade unions, it would be community groups and so on, professional organizations, associations, that whole sort of big group, and bring them also into a GNU in terms of on the delivery side. Part of our state is so bad, it's not going to be able to deliver. No matter, it's not going to happen tomorrow. So some parts will have to be delivered by civil society, some of our services, or by the private sector. I'll just give you an example. During COVID, I did this report for government looking at just from a civil society. Our civil society, actually employ more people than the construction industry, for example. 1.2 million people are employed in our civil society, and actually they deliver services. But if you have what we had in the past, we had a government the last 30 years that looks negatively about civil society. So if there's an ideological opposition to the idea of civil society, or even civil society delivery, then there's not going to be resource allocation to civil society, and there's not going to be support for civil society. So, you know, now in a GNU, if we can ideologically change that, to say, you know what, now let's allocate, but it's not just the allocation, but let's get the allocation right to the people, as Jordan was saying, get it to the right community groups and societies. I mean, the same, you know, Pearl, you also emphasized that. How do we do that? So if we can get this GNU in that context, and then there is the opposition to the GNU, is also important that there is a quality opposition to it. That in Parliament, let's just say, those parties like X and SA, MK, and EFF, they're going to be the opposition, that they actually oppose in a fact-based, evidence-based way. So it's not like sloganeering, because once you're in a space of opposing on slogans, there's not going to be qualitative oversight. We've seen it, the last cycle of the last Parliament, the last 5 years, been the worst, because absenteeism and the opposition didn't really look at policies, and then policies were rejected by the Constitutional Court as illegal. So, you know, that's just, and so on. So it's going to be very important that the parliamentary opposition is qualitative, but it's also very important that a civil society that also oppose properly, also in equality, not that they also hold the GNU accountable in a qualitative way, and so that's the expansive, from a practical way of the perfect GNU. If it can work, and then also in terms of just if the ministers can be appointed on a competence basis. I mean, I'm not really hopeful for long, obviously, that you will have politicians be appointed on the basis of competence. I mean, in an ideal GNU, ministers will be appointed outside politics also. You know, people who will be competent, who are not part of political parties, but who can deliver, would be appointed. I mean, a couple of years ago in South Korea, the leader, they had appointed a cabinet, and, you know, South Korea and those countries have very small cabinets. We talk about 10 to 15 people. Under correction, I can't remember if it was the Prime Minister or the President, but he said at a time when he announced the cabinet, he said, if there's anyone in the country who is better than any of these individuals, I would immediately appoint that individual. So these individuals, if anyone questions, can make a case that any of these individuals are not the best in the whole country and diaspora in their sector as they run as ministers, I will immediately change it.
Thank you, William. Thanks, David and Jordan, for really interesting responses to the questions. Pearl, we'll end off with you, and there are various comments that have resonated with the things you've said. Just to share them with you, I share the sentiment, says Salamina, and belief that the love element is so important. As cringe as it may be, it's very crucial to the conversations and negotiations. Kanisa says, Pearl's point resonates with me. Youth are truly in a lot of spaces trying to make a difference, but they aren't being taken seriously. And I'll put this last one to you, Pearl, just to respond to, because they're mostly comments. Florence says, young people have solutions to their challenges. All that the state needs to do is to listen to them and provide them with the necessary support.
Okay, I'm unmuted. I agree partly, but I think we have to take it slightly deeper than that, right? So I agree, yes, the state needs to listen to young people, but young people also need to be the state, right? So we're constantly hearing this thing of, you know, oh, young people are the leaders of tomorrow, and you're going to inherit this country. But if the majority of your voting electorate is young, if your majority of your labor force is young people are not inheriting a country. They are a part and parcel of the engine that drives it. And so I think we have to move beyond saying we just need the right resources or we just need the right support. We need to have young people in decision-making power, right? It boggles my mind that we look at our cabinet and the average age of our cabinet, and it's so far removed from the average age of our population. Now, it isn't to say that older people and older leaders have nothing to add, but we need to find a way to have more balance, right? Why is it when we say, oh, we want young people as ministers, it's almost like the way we approach the gender question. Are we ready for a woman to be the president? Are we ready for young people to lead? Yet young people lead in every single aspect of society already. One of the big questions we ask young people in our work at Youth Lab is, would you vote for a president under the age of 35 in a hypothetical world where we voted for our president? And by and large, the majority of young people over the last 5 to 8 years have said yes. We want to see more young people holding positions of power as ministers, as DGs, even as the president, right? And so we need a fundamental shift in what our public service looks like. Because even if you look at the way the bureaucracy is set up, right, there are so many young people in the machinery of government who are part of decision-making processes, but they don't often have a lot of power. And so I think whilst, yes, we need to equip young people with resources and support to do the work that they do, I think part of what it means to say that we take youth seriously is to say that youth are not a separate entity, right? Young people are not this kind of addition to the main meal, right? Young people have to be part of this machinery in a very real way. And I think part of that means mainstreaming young people throughout all spheres of government, throughout all spheres of communities, right? And I think we see it so well at local level. In communities where we have young people as ward councillors, they are one of the highest performing ward councillors in their municipalities often. And I think that demonstrates not just the stamina and the vigor of young people, but it also demonstrates what happens when you take communities that are largely run by young people and you give them the right access to power. And so, yes, I do agree that, young people are already moving this country in so many different ways, but we need to do more than just resource us. We need to be able to actually have young people in spaces of power in very, very real ways, not just as people that you consult when you're making decisions, or not just people that you think of as a group. Often what we do is we'll write a policy, and then right at the end we'll say, oh, we need to add young people, some interventions for young people in this. But I think as a country that is majority young, what we should be doing is having separate policies for older people, right? All of our work needs to be mainstreamed and focused towards young people. And they need to be spearheaded by young people themselves, instead of us kind of just waiting for 1 or 2 seats at the table, and the scraps that get given to us there.
A fitting way to end, and a reminder about our agency and the agency of young South Africans to continue their leadership role in the country. Pearl, thank you so much for sharing your expertise, having worked in this field for a long time, and bringing an important perspective to bear on the panel. Jordan, for injecting a much needed note of caution around false hope, and also reminding us of the importance of centering young people who are already leading in their communities, and taking us back to the fundamental challenges that confront our society and have confronted our society for centuries. William, thank you so much for sharing your expertise around government formation. I'm sure you've been learning a lot over the last few weeks and months, and thank you for the role that you're playing in trying to create coherence between warring parties for the good of our country. And David, of course, we thank you so much on the Trust for having convened this conversation, but also centering a key constituency, if I can call it that, in our society that actually doesn't vote, but maybe is the most important outcome of our votes, which is South African children, their education, their nutrition, and their basic needs. And I know that the Trust has a program focusing on closing the food gap. So I would encourage everyone watching this to turn their attention to that important program and, you know, the basic needs of food provided for children. If a society can't provide that, then what are we even doing here? So David, thank you so much for centering that and for convening us here today. This brings a close to our conversation. It's an era of hope and anxiety in equal measure, but I hope today has given you some insight into not only what to be hopeful about, but also what to be anxious about, and also how we as a country can take the first key steps in this new era of coalitions to really live up to the dream that we all share of a united, prosperous, and just society. Thank you very much for joining us, and I hope you have a great day further.